The film Taste of Tea by Katsuhito Ishii follows the life of the Haruno family. The film follows each member on a personal quest to complete a certain task that holds value to each member. These quests include the youngest, Shochiku, completing a full backflip to get rid of a larger version of herself that follows her. Hajime, the brother, to pursue a love interest after he is heartbroken when his previous one moves away. Uncle Anyo is a sound mixer tasked with creating a song for his brother-in-law, E.T. Takadori, a manga artist who is longing for songwriting and wishes to create a hit single. The mother, Yoshiko, who is following her father's footsteps and working on an animated film. Nobu, the heavy work-focused father, and Akira, the quirky grandpa with a larger-than-life personality who creates his art in secrecy. Nobu and Akira do not have a direct goal like the other characters, but nonetheless are important to the film's heavily themed focus, the family unit. Taste of Tea is a collage of genres, coming of age, fantasy, animation, surrealism, and even a Yakuza film. But at the end of the day, the family comes together for quality time, advice, and support. The film Taste of Tea uses the family unit, a predominantly traditional theme during the studio era of Japanese cinema, to explore a culture shift in the family unit and in Japanese media entering the 2000s by having conflicts of traditional versus modern or old versus new. The idea of the family unit in Japanese cinema was popularized by Yasujiro Ozu in the 1930s and 40s. During the time Ozu created these films, the family stood for tradition and gender roles of each of the family members. The father was always constantly working, the mother a stay-at-home housewife, while the children of the family explored the world around them. Taste of Tea uses the family unit groundwork displayed in Ozu's films, but shows the viewers how the family unit has changed. This change shows a representation of the old versus the new. The film challenges family tradition and even gender roles of each member. An example of tradition versus the modern era in the film Taste of Tea was during the sequence of Nobu and Hajime riding on the train to travel home. The scene is mostly quiet, with him and his father sitting in silence until two men in manga costumes get on the train. The younger men are being comical and loud. Hajime keeps staring at the two men, but his father keeps correcting him and asking him not to look. As the train comes to a stop, Nobu and Hajime exit, so do the two men in costumes. As they are walking away, an enraged man starts insulting and attacking the two men in costumes, until he is dragged away by a group of men we can infer is the Yakuza. This scene displays the idea of tradition versus the modern era. Nobu, being a more traditional figure, still abides by traditional morals. He sits on the train quietly, not disturbing the other passengers, and corrects his son, who is staring, while on the other hand, the two men in costumes represent a more modern idea of society, where they choose not to follow tradition and not conform to the traditional politeness while riding on the train. Where the scene is interesting is when the man attacks the cosplayers and is dragged off by the Yakuza. This can be analyzed as how mistakes made by the older generation can hurt the newer one. The Yakuza in the scene represents an older period in Japan where people had to turn to a more corrupt way of making a living. The man who attacked the cosplayers symbolizes these mistakes, and as he attacks, it represents how these mistakes hurt the next generation. And when he is captured and dragged away by the Yakuza, it shows how the corrupt side of society that started in the past is still an issue in the modern day. The scene represents a duality and conflict of the struggle between the old versus the new.
Along with the contradictions of Japan's traditional past versus the early 2000s society in the midst of modernization are the struggles of finding individual success that follows the unique, self-expressive, non-traditional, and creative endeavors and personalities the parents and grandpa have. From the 1990s to the early 2000s, Japan underwent a stock market crash, leading the country down an unfortunate economic recession. At the same time, major historical events in the mid-90s occurred, such as the Great Hanshin earthquake in 1995 and the Tokyo gas attacks by Aum Shinrikyo, leaving a heavy mark on Japanese culture. Throughout these tough times, Japanese cinema had its lowest box office numbers in 1996, while facing a decline in studio production. Towards the early 2000s, however, an organized new wave movement, independent from the studios, called New Japanese Cinema, takes place and introduces a unique and large presence of genre cinema, which attracts a wide range of audiences while exploring individualistic, detached styles of cinema. This meant drawing inspiration from both the past and this new era of cinema and technology. According to the book Tracing Pathways, this new era embraced avant-garde movements and directors who persevere on the path of tradition, masters and artisans of the past who stepped back into the limelight in their senior years. Above all, it has generated a flood of adaptations from novels, manga, anime, TV series, and video games. The new Japanese cinema movement can bring about a flood of inspiration and creativity when reflecting on Japan's film history, while interacting with a new, modernized culture of technology. Yet, in this phase of being in between the past and the present, lingers this pressure of finding individual success and style. Reflected in the taste of tea, this unique and creative family also finds inspiration from their own experiences as well as their own relatives. The kids, however, being young, still have trouble finding their own self-expression and thus their own successful traits. To illustrate, Sachiko, being the youngest and the only daughter of the family, is quiet, reflective, and observant. She spends most of her days lying down or sitting on the porch dozing off, listening to her grandpa help with her mother's animation projects and her uncle's bizarre stories. At the same time, we see a giant figure of her that lingers and watches her every move when she is in this state of reflection. It isn't until she achieves a backflip on a bar that this giant figure floats away. With her parents, grandpa, and uncle having such creative and modern careers, Sachiko is surrounded by unique, imaginative, and hardworking individuals. It's as if she does not fully feel a part of this group until she successfully achieves something just as great and just as acceptable to this family. Yet it is a strong connection with her family that eventually helps her overcome this pressure, or in terms of the film, this giant Sachiko. Towards the end of the film, after their grandpa had passed, they found his animation booklets dedicated to the mother, father, son, and daughter, which left Sachiko feeling inspired to keep pursuing a backflip, as her own booklet by her grandpa illustrated her finally achieving one. Sachiko's storyline reveals this pressure from family success and traditions, yet the possibility of finding inspiration and help from family and older generations as grandpa inspires her mother and eventually her. Similarly, the 2000s Japanese cinema era explores self-identity and seeks success in this newer era of technology, while reflecting and drawing inspiration from traditional Japan.
Along with this new era of filmic self-reflection and exploration, ushered into Japanese cinema by the 1990s and 2000s, came new ways of visually communicating such introspection. Taste of Tea specifically utilizes historical juxtaposition as well as elements of surrealism to demonstrate this process. There are many instances of juxtaposition throughout the Taste of Tea. Take, for instance, the location of the Haruno family residence. They live in a very rural area, in a house that looks rather traditional. However, their family is anything but that. Nearly every member of their family is involved in an occupation that is not at all traditional and is instead rather progressive. Excluding Sachiko and Hajime, who are still in school, their mother, Yoshiko, and her father before her, Akira, are both animators. Uncle Ayano is a sound mixer, and their father, Nobuo, practices hypnotherapy. Nobuo's occupation provides yet another layer of historical juxtaposition, as he still occupies the traditional role of the quote-unquote breadwinner, but with a rather unconventional occupation. Surrealism was used to achieve a deeper visual exploration of the self in a number of Japanese films throughout the 1990s and 2000s, most notably in films like Satoshi Kon's 2006 hit Paprika, but is also used in a couple of different forms throughout the runtime of The Taste of Tea. According to André Breton's Manifesto of Surrealism, there are a couple of key principles that make a piece of art surreal: the reconciliation of the dream and reality, the celebration of the marvelous, elevation of automatic and base human responses, and revolt against bourgeois constructions of society. Sachiko's giant checks off at least two of those points, that being the fact that the audience can see both Sachiko and Giant Sachiko on screen at the same time, reconciling the dream and reality, as well as the celebration of the marvelous. Her giant is a tactic of visual surrealism used to externalize Sachiko's introspection for the sake of narrative progression. The train scene from earlier is another example of this type of surrealism used to progress the narrative. Then there is Uncle Ayano. He is also dealing with self-reflection, but not in the same way that we see Sachiko struggle. His is much less pressing than his niece's, as we witness many varied encounters throughout the film, rather than one reoccurring issue like Sachiko's giant. He recalls being haunted by the ghost of an injured man during his childhood, has an encounter with a random baseball player, makes friends with a dancer, runs into an ex, and through it all is occupied by the undertaking of the production of a new hit single. While most of these encounters include some level of visual surrealism or absurdity, the stronger reoccurring theme is an element of narrative surrealism. That is, none of his encounters make sense per se, but Uncle Ayano thinks nothing of them. To him, they are simply a part of life, perhaps in the same way that self-reflection is a part of life. His exploration of self serves as a juxtaposition to Sachiko and her journey as well, as she feels pressured to find herself rather quickly, while Ayano goes through life seemingly constantly reflecting on his experiences and how they have shaped and will continue to shape him. The family unit has long been a staple of traditional Japanese cinema, from the works of Yasujiro Ozu to the present, but what has not been a traditional aspect of the staple is the addition of surrealism as a means of further exploration. However, just as the 1990s and 2000s ushered in new themes of self-exploration, they also made room for new ways of exploring traditional themes of Japanese cinema with both visual and narrative tactics, like historical juxtaposition and surrealism. It is in this way that Katsuhito Ishii's The Taste of Tea explores cultural shifts in Japanese cinema, from traditional to modern, old to new, and past to present, all through the uniquely varied experiences of the Haruno family.